Good evening. I'm Elizabeth Estrada. I'm the democracy editor here at Spotlight PA. I want to thank you all for spending your Thursday evening with us. We're so excited to get into this really important conversation about accessibility within Pennsylvania's elections. For those of you who are new to our programming or aren't familiar with Spotlight PA, I want to let you all know a little bit about who we are and our work. We are an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit newsroom producing investigative and public service journalism about our state government and other urgent statewide issues. And when it comes to elections, we're doing a lot of work to keep you all informed, producing different candidate guides and interactive tools that can really help you understand the voting processes here in Pennsylvania and to kind of help you figure out, perhaps you don't know who to vote for in terms of the row offices. We have some quizzes for you to kind of help you navigate and figure out which candidate really best matches your values. So you can take a look at that, and I'll share the website link for that a little bit later on. And all of this work really isn't possible without you, our readers, our audience, and especially our members who so kindly donate to kind of make sure that our work is able to continue. So with that, I'd like to pause here and, take a moment to ask you that if you have the means to do so, to please make a donation to support our work. It keeps our journalism going, and you can do that by visiting spotlightpa.org/donate. Every little bit helps, but also if you're able to just share our work, get it out there, that also is another way to support us as well. So before we get into tonight's conversation, just a few quick housekeeping items for tonight's kind of program. We are recording tonight's event so that folks who aren't able to make it are able to watch it whenever they have some time. And when it comes to any questions that come up during tonight's conversation, you can feel free to use the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen in Zoom and submit a question, and we'll try to get to those later. And also, if you require it, or if you just like to have a closed caption option, that is also available during tonight's event. And you can find that also at the bottom of your screen next to your kind of Q&A function on Zoom as well. So with all of that stuff out of the way, let's get into it. As I'm sure many of us are familiar, state and federal laws protect our rights to cast a ballot regardless of race, ethnicity, language, or disability. But the reality is that when it comes to voting access here in Pennsylvania, it isn't always that clean and it isn't always that equal. In recent years, we've seen a lot of civil rights organizations find issues that affect people who have disabilities or whose primary language is not English, but in fact, another language. Additionally, at least 16 counties in the state do not give equal opportunity to voters to fix their flawed mail ballots. And this is according to the ACLU of Pennsylvania. And also, last year, a Spotlight PA and VoteBeat investigation and analysis found similar disparities. So, to help us break down some of these issues and explore this really important and vast topic, we have an amazing panel of esteemed folks tonight, experts who are joining us to kind of shed light on these issues. So, Kate, I want to get started with you. Kate Wang-Pu is my fellow colleague at Spotlight PA. She's a government reporter. Kate, can you share with us a little bit more about your work here at Spotlight and what you've been focusing on this election?
Yeah, thanks everyone for being here. I'm happy to be chatting about elections. So I'm a state government reporter. I essentially just follow what the state legislature does, what the governor does, various department agencies. But I've also been lucky enough to cover redistricting and in particular election administration, the election code, talking to election directors about what kind of voter administration, election administration practices that Pennsylvania does. So it's a very exciting topic. I'm excited to chat more about it.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining us. Um, Marion K. Schneider, I want to move on to you. You are the Senior Policy Counsel for Voting Rights, the ACLU of Pennsylvania. Can you talk to us a little bit more about what the scope of your work entails and what you've been focusing on these recent months?
Sure. So I'm a member of the advocacy policy team, but I also do a lot of litigation. But the work that we do in Pennsylvania is all done through coalition. There's a group of more than 30 organizations that we work with and provide some support for, legal supports. But we do legislative advocacy. We talk to county election officials. We advocate with the Department of State on the advocacy side. And then on the litigation side, we try to bring lawsuits to gain clarity in the law and protect the right to vote. So all of our litigation is voter centric. And we are making sure that every valid registered voter in Pennsylvania has the ability to vote in without unnecessary obstacles and to have that vote counted. I don't, you don't want to hear the nuts and bolts of what we do, but we have a lot of resources on our website.
Wonderful. Yes, a lot of really important work, and we'll definitely make sure to share out some of those resources throughout tonight's conversation. And next up, and certainly last but not least, we have Perry Jude Radisick. Perry Jude is the Chief Executive Officer at Disability Rights Pennsylvania. Thank you so much for joining us, Perry Jude. Can you talk to us a little bit about what exactly Disability Rights Pennsylvania is, what it does, and some of the work that you do there?
Sure, thank you, and thanks for having me, and thanks to everyone who's sharing your evening with us. Uh, Disability Rights Pennsylvania has been around for almost 50 years. We were authorized by Congress, so you'll find one of us in every state and territory across our United States of America. And Congress wanted an entity in every state that would protect against abuse and neglect, protect against discrimination, and work on really important issues like accessibility. So we get over 6,000 calls a year. Our services are free, so we have an intake system. We do a lot of education work for children and adults with disabilities, Medicaid, Medicare, and voting rights work besides employment, housing, and transportation discrimination. Lots of work. If you go to, I see it's in the chat now, disabilityrightspa.org, you can find out so much more about us.
Great. Well, thank you all for the amazing work that you do. It's so critical, I think, on a regular basis, but especially when it comes to voting access and to creating resources for voters, not only for this election, but beyond in every election cycle. Perry Jude, I want to start with you. Can you share with us some of the barriers or challenges that voters who have disabilities may encounter, particularly when they're trying to vote in person at a physical polling location? What do people typically encounter, or what have been some instances that people have encountered?
Sure, I have a list of about 9 things, so I'll try to get through them quickly. And this is just sort of the tip of what we get. These are calls that come to our office or come to election protection on a yearly basis. And the first thing you think of is the polling place accessible, right? Like if I'm a person with a disability, am I going to be able to get in? And the answer isn't always yes. It's better than it's been, but the answer isn't always yes. And there are a variety of reasons for that. If you want to, we can certainly get into that, but not every polling place is as accessible as it should be. Another one is if you're blind or low vision, right? The most important thing to you is being able to vote privately or independently. That's guaranteed in a federal law called the Help America Vote Act. So every precinct is supposed to have one accessible voting machine that has those accessibility features that someone could put in their headset, has tactile support to be able to vote and to be able to read back the ballot and to be able to cast that ballot privately and independently. What we find and what we get calls on is not every precinct and not every poll worker knows how to set those machines up. or they set them up and then something fails and the machine's not functioning properly. And then that we get problems related to not being able to vote privately and independently, long wait times. Um, you know, you it- anyone who has physical limitations encountering a long line, we don't want them to turn around and go home. Like, no, there's a way to remedy that. We can get into that, but long wait times is another barrier to people who show up on election day. If you're deaf or hard of hearing, you might sign. As your primary method of communication. And if the polling place doesn't have a sign language interpreter or video interpreting, that could be a barrier if you have questions about voting. So there's so many more issues where I'm happy to get into all of them, but those are some of the big ones that we find on election day. Accessibility, maybe even the front door entrance isn't accessible. There's an entrance supposed to be around the back, and that door is locked. So we have a way to deal with that, and we'll get into how you deal with an issue like that if that happens to you.
Yeah, so I'm curious. You've listed off so many things, and there's more, as you mentioned, that you didn't even
Oh
get to
yeah,
there.
yeah.
So what is the state of Pennsylvania legally required to provide to these voters?
Yeah.
Uh, what are you seeing kind of in terms of like the gap of resources of service within these polling places?
So everything that I'm about to talk about is federal law, and a lot of it is enshrined in our state code. And so the polling place has to be accessible, period. That's it. That's the law. It has to be. And there are sometimes if you use a church where it's not gonna be, but you can employ temporary modifications, right? It's okay to do that. It's okay to bring in a ramp. The county can give a church a ramp to be able to get up a curb that doesn't have a curb cut. That's perfectly fine. But that temporary modification has to be deployed. So you got to have an accessible polling place. You have to have at least one accessible voting device in every precinct. You have to, the law also requires effective communication. It also requires accommodations and modifications. So if somebody wants to see their ballot in Braille or read it in a different way, they can have access to that material. Registering to vote is also supposed to be an accessible is supposed to be done in an accessible way. So websites have to be accessible so that people with disabilities have access to the same information that everybody else does about where to go vote. That has to be accessible. And so these are just some of the things that are required. Accessible polling place or temporary modifications and accommodations, modifications, and accessible voting machine in every precinct are the top ones.
Yeah, so I want to pivot to language access in just a moment, but what's the kind of reasoning as to why sometimes these options aren't available? Is it because there aren't like the right, let's say, like poll workers available who can provide something like, people who are familiar with like ASL, for example, or is it like a funding issue? If you could just kind of quickly speak to that.
It's probably all the above is what we find, right? I mean, a county is not going to have enough resources really to put an ASL interpreter, nor are there that many in every polling place around the state of Pennsylvania. But there are ways that you can work with people with disabilities in your community. So you can use a video interpreting to make sure that effective communication is there if someone has a question. I think one of the issues is poll workers get trained absolutely. They're wonderful people. They want to do a good job, but sometimes they don't have the depth or breadth of knowledge that is required to be able to effectively communicate with every different person that's going to show up on election day. And if you haven't been through that before, you may stumble a little bit before you really understand what are your obligations under the law.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. We'll get back to kind of some of the resources that are available for folks a little bit later on in today's conversation. But for now, I want to turn to you, Marion, to talk a little bit about language access. And perhaps, this is similar to what Perry Jude was saying, but in Pennsylvania, what are voters, entitled to when it comes to options that are not in English?
Well, first of all, any voter who does not speak English or does not read or speak English well is entitled to bring an assister of choice under the Voting Rights Act. That's a federal law, Section 208, that allows you to bring any person not only into the polling place, but into the voting booth to read English and interpret it for the voter. And a lot of times, people's children perform that function. But also under the Voting Rights Act, when a certain population that doesn't speak English well reaches a threshold, then the county is required to provide all voting materials in that language. And so Philadelphia, Lehigh, and Berks counties are covered, and this is Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act, and they must provide all voting materials in English and Spanish, and they must provide interpretation services especially in the precincts in which there are mainly Spanish-speaking voters. Philadelphia is also required to do the same thing for Chinese. Then they have materials in simplified and traditional Chinese language. So the 2020 census, yeah, it may or may not have been accurate. And there are some counties that are just like right under that threshold. And so they have voluntarily provided voting materials in Spanish. Lancaster County is one. Lancaster County has had Spanish English ballots for a long time. But also because of a lawsuit brought by CASA and Latino Justice, York County is now also providing materials in English and Spanish. And there's been a lot of work, and as I mentioned, we work in coalition, and there's been a lot of work by the coalition to try to persuade counties who may not have a formal legal requirement to provide information. I do want to talk about another part of the Voting Rights Act because Puerto Ricans who move to the mainland from Puerto Rico are entitled to Spanish language materials, voting materials, because of their particular status, and they do not have to meet a population threshold. So, under a different section of the Voting Rights Act, 4E, if there is a cohort of limited English proficient Puerto Rican residents who were educated in Puerto Rico in Spanish language schools, they are entitled to materials in Spanish and English. So there's an effort on that front. The problem is that the U.S. Census does not identify, doesn't break out populations of Puerto Rican residents who have moved to the continental United States, but there's been a huge migration because of the hurricane damage in Puerto Rico. So the Puerto Rican diaspora is quite getting very large. But I do want to point out two important things that have happened recently. One at the Department of State. The Department of State at the beginning of 2023 issued language access guidance for the counties and really adopted best practices for encouraging counties to be more inclusive and more accessible to voters who do not speak English as their first language. And they have also recently professionally translated, not relying on Google Translate, but professionally translated their website and voting materials in, I think, is another 12 additional languages. Similarly, Philadelphia voluntarily, and as a result of a lot of advocacy by coalition led by All Voting is Local, has also agreed to provide materials in 5 additional languages. So we're making progress. Most of the progress is not legislative. It's all county by county advocacy. So I do want to highlight those.
Yeah, that's so incredible, the work that folks on the ground have been doing. And as somebody who has been there and had to translate for my mom, and oftentimes has done that for many family members, I think it's so incredible that, people in across different counties have not only because of like the population change, but in some instances, like have really been able to advocate for additional resources in their own language. So that's incredible. Um, I'll get back to language access in a moment. And Kate, I see you. I'm going to come to you, but Perry Jude, I want to go back to you for a moment to talk about voting by mail. Obviously, this is something that came about universally, no excuse, mail voting through Act 77, passed in 2019. And, I'm curious to know about, why this availability of voting by mail without any excuse, like the impact and the importance on the disability community. And also in terms
Yeah.
of drop boxes, I know that Disability Rights Pennsylvania penned a letter earlier this year to Lebanon County because they were going to get rid of like their single drop box, and that was going to disproportionately affect folks with disabilities in particular. So can you talk a little bit about the impact of drop boxes and mail voting, and also let us know what's happening in Lebanon County? Where did that land?
Yeah, sure. So that's a lot. We'll first start with the importance of mail-in voting. More people with disabilities, over 50%, vote by mail. That was a study done by Rutgers in the 2020 presidential election. And there are many reasons for that, right? Like, one, we're not always sure we're going to show up and the place is going to be accessible, number one. Number two, there are transportation issues. So voting by mail becomes incredibly important if I might be a person with a disability that works during the day, relies on public transportation, and I live in a smaller community where my public transportation shuts down at 4 or 5 o'clock at night. Getting to and getting back from a polling place is going to be really difficult. Or if that polling place is further away from me and I rely on public transportation, or I have to Uber or Lyft or find something accessible transportation. So there are transportation barriers to getting to the polls. There are polling places that are barriers to voting. And if I'm a person who is so frustrated with trying to vote on an accessible machine when I get there, and my experience is it doesn't work, I might not show up again. So I might just go ahead and vote by mail. So many reasons why people with disabilities find voting by mail important. What we like about going to just vote by mail instead of having to use an absentee ballot, although that still exists, is that I now have to acknowledge to a poll worker and disclose a protected health status to someone. And everybody doesn't want to disclose that. So being able to check a box that says I just want a mail ballot without having to disclose protected information or have to get to a doctor to have them sign a form for something is really important. And it really actually is more accessible than having the absentee ballot in the first place, if that makes sense. Like, we're all just doing it on on an equal basis, right? I just get my mail-in ballot and then I can get it turned in. So all of that said, that's why we think mail-in balloting is important. Now, drop boxes are incredibly important because it gives me flexibility to drop off that ballot. We all know mail can be incredibly slow, especially as we get closer to the election, right? And sometimes the deadlines don't always allow for a 5-day lag time for the post office to get my mail to where it needs to go. So I might have to drop my ballot off at a drop box to make sure that it's counted on election day. And so drop boxes are incredibly important because it gives people with disabilities, and frankly, all people, the flexibility to drop that ballot off at multiple times throughout the week. And so we find that incredibly important. And so, yes, our letter to Lebanon County cited all of the reasons, including transportation barriers for people with disabilities, that make a drop box incredibly important to the equality of voting for people with disabilities. Now, the last I heard, and maybe Marianne has an update, my understanding was that Lebanon put that drop box back in. Yeah. Yeah. And it wasn't just us, right? Like there was advocacy from all parts of the community that really felt like that Dropbox was a secure and fair way to conduct the election and enables people that flexibility to get their ballot to that Dropbox.
That's a great story, though, if you want to hear the details.
Yeah, if you want to take a quick moment and then I want to get to Kate Marion if you have anything to add. Sounds like you do.
Well, it just was an example of how the coalition works together to mobilize people. And so the first thing is when they put it on the agenda, they didn't properly comply with the Sunshine Act. So we sent them a letter saying, hey, you need to comply with the Sunshine Act. And so by forcing them to comply with the Sunshine Act, that's the act that says meetings have to be public and they have to be notified, gave us some time to mobilize people. And so at a county commissioner, board of elections meeting where they used to maybe having two people in the audience, there were like 30 people in the audience. And there was we have now gotten this down to a real science of our mobilization toolkit where we get people to send emails, send phone calls, and all this thing. The They would have taken away that Dropbox, except instead they told the election director, come back with a proposal. And so they did. It's a ballot drop-off location that is staffed by a person. We affectionately call it the ballot barn. And but now, I mean, the problem that Perry Jude was talking about at that courthouse, the security, you have to go through security, the office is on the second floor. It's a pain and it's not particularly accessible. So having the ability to just hand your ballot to somebody through your car window is a huge benefit to people who would otherwise not be able to navigate getting up to the second floor. So, but it's a great example of the kind of advocacy that works when people show up and cared enough to show up.
Absolutely. What I'm hearing a lot in this conversation is that really people are driving a lot of this change because they need it, right? They require access in their own language and the language that they speak. They require a Dropbox to be able to successfully and conveniently vote. So I love all the kind of people power that I'm hearing about in these stories. Kate, I'm going to go to you. Thank you for being patient. We were talking about drop boxes, and that is not the only aspect of election administration that different counties handle differently, right? One of those additional elements is something called notice and cure or ballot curing. Can you explain to us what is this? What is this policy? And why do some counties do it and others not?
Yeah, so essentially, when Act 77 was passed, it didn't specify whether or not counties had to allow their voters who voted by mail, if there were like minor mistakes, like, dating the ballot incorrectly or not signing properly, not signing where you're supposed to on your mail ballot, if they were allowed to go in and fix that. That's called curing your ballot. So there were like a series of lawsuits that happened after Act 77 about curing. And the conclusion that the state Supreme Court said was basically like, choose your own adventure. Like counties can do whatever they want to do. You are allowed to, you do not have to. So as a result of that, county by county, the ACLU did a story on it. We did a story on it a few years ago now. Counties they'll call folks to come into the office, the election office, and fix their ballot. Sometimes they'll just notify them. Sometimes they don't say anything at all. So it really differs on a county by county basis.
Yeah, I love the choose your own adventure kind of metaphor because that's truly what it is, right? And so obviously, this conversation is about accessibility and it may be obvious, but I would love to hear from your perspective in terms of all of the work that you've done around this and reporting on it. Like, why is this an accessibility issue? It's obviously something that is like election administration related, but like, where does accessibility come within when it comes to this issue?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, it's about your accessibility to vote, like your access to being able to actually cast your ballot and have your voice be heard in an election. Because Pennsylvania has the free and equal election provision in the state constitution, which basically says that every vote should be equal to each other in the state. And when you have residents in different counties, but all in Pennsylvania, on different counties, to not have different rights to cast their ballot, that functionally kind of infringes upon that right. So it's fairly I guess it's fairly fundamental to the idea of being having access and being able to vote in the first place.
Yeah. And could you share a bit about why this is something that some counties do and others don't? Like, what is the kind of reasoning or rationale behind, like some of the 16 counties that don't participate in this kind of approach?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a range. County election directors, the election code is messy, election law is messy. So a lot of times they're consulting with the solicitors, they're reading the text of the law itself and collectively trying to figure out what is the most right thing to do. But that can result in a lot of different interpretations. Adding on the layer of, and then you add that onto the layer of like, functionally, it can be hard if it's a really small staffed election office, then it can be harder to reach out to every single voter that has some sort of issue with their ballot and send them like have them come in. Not all election offices are open during like all work hours, all days of the week. And that proves to be another issue. But from the election directors I've talked to, most of the times it's just different interpretations of election law itself.
Thank you for sharing that with us. Mary, and I want to turn to you because the ACLU of Pennsylvania is involved in a couple of lawsuits regarding this issue, I think in Butler and Washington counties. Can you share a little bit more about these lawsuits? Like what's the goal of the suits and where do they stand currently?
Sure. Well, they're adjacent to the notice and cure issue because I want to be clear. Notice and cure is a term of art that refers to the counties alerting voters in a proactive way and allowing them to correct the errors on their mail ballot envelopes, only on the outer envelope, in advance of elections. The two lawsuits we have, people may be familiar with provisional ballots. That is a process that has been around for 22 years. It was required, states were required to adopt it after the passage of the Help America Vote Act in Congress in 2002. And that's a statutory failsafe. It's there, it arose out of out of Florida because people were turned away from the polls and they didn't have because they weren't in the poll books. That was the original reason. But it's very clear that if a voter believes they should be entitled to vote in that polling location, they are entitled to submit a provisional ballot. It's a fail-safe to preserve the right to vote. So the case out of Butler County is that if a voter forgot their secrecy envelope, so there's three errors: date, missing or incorrect, no secrecy envelope, no signature. If in Butler County, they would allow voters to cure the date and the signature, but not the missing secrecy envelope. I cannot offer an explanation as to that difference, but we argue that the provisional ballot process is a statutory process. It's available to any voter who has not previously voted in the election. And if the county has already decided they're not going to count the ballot, they had Butler County was able to weigh the ballot, so they knew which ones were missing their secrecy envelope, and they had already notified the voters through the statewide database called the SURE system. And to Kate's point earlier, there's very little burden on counties. They have to use the shore system. They are statutorily required to use the shore system. So if they properly code mistaken ballots in the shore system, that sets into operation a chain of events that is more likely than not that the voter will receive notice that their ballot had an error on it. So that lawsuit, we argued you have to count that provisional ballot. If the voters are previously submitted mail ballots not going to count, you must count the provisional ballot because the provisional ballot ensures that a voter gets to vote once and only once, not 2 times and not 0 times. So that we had won that in the Commonwealth Court. We lost in the trial court, won in the Commonwealth Court, and now we're waiting a decision in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. It's fully briefed. It's been up there for a couple of weeks. The second lawsuit is also adjacent to notice and cure, and that arises out of Washington County. And that set of facts was particularly egregious. Washington County decided they weren't going to do a voluntary notice and cure program. Perfectly fine. But they kind of went beyond that and they decided they weren't going to correctly code the ballots in the shore system so that it was misleading. Voters thought there was nothing wrong with their ballots. And not only that, they scanned them, they saw there was a defect, and they segregated them. So there were 2 bins for each precinct, the to be counted bin and the do not count bin. And they knew it. And nothing changed. And the Board of Elections instructed the staff that if voters were to call the office and their ballot was in the do not count bin, they were not to tell the voter that their ballot was in the do not count bin. So to us, to our partners, and we do all this litigation in partnership with the Public Interest Law Center and Pro Bono Council. It's fundamentally unfair for Washington County to know that the voter has a disqualifying defect, that they will be deprived of their fundamental right to vote and not tell them, that the Constitution guarantees procedural due process. And what that means is before you deprive someone of a constitutional right to vote, you have to tell them. And they can take steps. They could challenge that decision, or they can take advantage of a pre-existing separate statutory process to vote a provisional ballot at the polling place. But if they don't know, they can't take advantage of any of that process. So we actually won that case at all levels, and it is now pending in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. The briefing on that just closed last Friday. So we're waiting for a decision in that case.
Wow. So do you anticipate there being a decision made before November 5th for these cases?
I would hope so, but the rules for voters will not change. I want to be perfectly clear. You have to seal your ballot in the secrecy envelope and seal that within the outer envelope, and you have to sign and date the outer envelope. That's not going to change. I don't think we do have a pending case on the date, but the impact of these cases doesn't go to what voters have to do. It goes to what the election administrators have to do after the election and how they count the ballots. So the impact on voters is low, and the burden on the administrators is actually, it's not even a burden, it's less burdensome if they don't have to deal with the date issue. And the burden of correctly coding it in the shore system is, we had testimony from the Washington County election director. It's basically selecting a different code in the drop-down menu. That's all it is.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all those details with us. I think that this is something that a lot of people are interested in knowing more about, and the details can just be very confusing and overwhelming. So I really appreciate that breakdown. I think, Kate, I'm going to go to you for this question, but I think maybe you and Marion can kind of tag team it. So if you are in a county where you actually are reached out to and you're asked to kind of fix one of these common errors, whether it's that you misstated it or forgot the date or missed a signature or something like that, like what happens then? Like you're called, you have to go somewhere. What does that process look like?
It differs county to county, but typically they say like you can come into the election office, the county election office, and fix it essentially and turn it back in. If the issue is, I think there are also occasions, or if the issue is big, they call you in and instead you fill in a provisional ballot and you have
Oh,
to
no.
cancel There aren't? Okay.
Provisional
My
ballots is an in-person process, it's completely in-person process.
Right,
Uh,
right. Okay, okay. I think I had heard of occasions where people filled in provisional ballots at either county election offices. Okay. I must be mistaken. My bad.
no, provisional ballot process is an in-person on election day process alone. It is not I mean, so I put a link in the chat about our map. So there's really two different ways. Actually, there's probably three different ways that things could happen. Like Kate said, they could be asked to go into the election office and either, like if they're missing a date, write the date on it, or if they're missing a signature, write the signature on it, or they could be the original ballot could be canceled and they could be given a completely new ballot packet, mail ballot packet, and start over and do it right, and then hand it in right there. The other option is that some counties just contact the voter and say, we're going to cancel your first ballot and mail you a replacement ballot, and you fill it out, do it right this time, and send that back. And the third option, which at least three counties are doing, Allegheny, Dauphin, and Delaware County, is that they don't cancel the first ballot, but they send everything back to the voter with a new outer envelope and a new secrecy envelope and say, you made a mistake. Here's the mistake you made. Take your ballot out of the original one, put it in these new envelopes, do it right, and send it back. And so those are the three different ways. But provisional voting is in person on election day, and it's specifically about when poll workers at the polling place in real time can't confirm the voters' eligibility to cast a ballot. So I just want to, I don't mean to be hammering on that, but there's a lot of confusion around, and there's a lot of mis and disinformation. So that's why and I did drop our map in the chat, so you can check out what your county does. I think that the one issue, and this goes to Perry Jude's constituency, is that if a voter has a disability and makes a mistake and they can't go in, or they can't go to the polls on election day, then that's a difficult situation, and we are mulling what would be the legal options in those situations.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for clarifying. I think it's so important because it is confusing, as you said, and it's also happening, once ballots start being counted, which doesn't happen until election day in Pennsylvania. And so, this process is very critical and like happens very quickly, I imagine, as well, or maybe slowly, but like there's a sense of urgency for the person being notified. So there's like a lot at play, and I appreciate you kind of getting as specific as you did. So I have a few more questions before we kind of get to the audience Q&A. And Marion, I'm going to stick with you just for a few more minutes. If you could briefly, if you could, because there's a lot
Sorry.
happening. But could you talk a little bit about some of the other legal challenges that are happening at this time, that could impact people's ability to vote? We've kind of talked a lot about the mail ballots. Is that kind of primarily what's happening? Is there anything else that, people should be aware of, or that we're waiting on like any kind of ruling from a court from?
So all of the most impactful, the significant cases are the ones that we brought on behalf of voters and civic engagement organizations. The two cases on that we talked about, and there's one other case that was an appeal from the Philadelphia Board of Elections in the special election that was held in September, and that it's constitutional challenge to the meaningless date requirement, because we've been litigating over this date requirement since 2021. And in the cases that we brought, it's not used for any purpose. It doesn't show when because we have a received by deadline in Pennsylvania. So either your ballot's there by the deadline or it's not. So the handwritten date is meaningless for that, and it doesn't have anything to do with eligibility. So that's in the Commonwealth Court, and we're waiting for a decision. It's a discretionary appeal to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, so I don't know whether it will go up. As far as there have been other cases, I'll call them nuisance lawsuits, that have been filed by people who want to cast doubt on election processes. None of those have gone anywhere. I will say this, what we know to be true is that Pennsylvania election officials work really hard, and by and large, all of them try to run smooth elections. They do it different ways. They may have different approaches, but at the end of the day, that's what they're trying to do. And we butt heads with them over issues. We make sure that they do what they can to make it easier and more accessible to voters. But that's what we know is true. And so we just want to make sure that we just want to get clarity in the law to make sure every eligible voter can vote. So I don't think there are any of the other lawsuits will have an impact on this election.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I want to pivot to some resources. Perry Jude, could you share, what somebody should do if a voter with a disability, if you kind of go to a polling place and you're experiencing some access issues, whether that means like you actually can't physically get into the space because there's not a ramp or let's say an elevator or something like that. Um, what do you do in that instance?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. As Marian has been saying, nothing gets done, as an organization on our own. We do it in coalition, and we belong to a coalition called Election Protection, which the number is 866 R vote. And we really encourage people with disabilities, people of color, anyone who may run into a barrier leading up to or on election day to call 866 R vote. And in fact, there are phone numbers and that will access 866 R vote in languages other than English, which is also incredibly important, so that you can get that situation remedied. And we try to remedy it as soon as possible. I think Marion can certainly address the same question. A call comes in, it goes through intake, it gets assigned out, and people will call election directors right then and there and remedy it. So if it's a locked door and a person with the disability can't get in the locked door because that's the only accessible entrance, you call 866 R vote. We'll get that door opened for you. I mean, it's that quick and that easy.
Excellent. And I want to remind our audience, if you have any questions, now's the time to kind of pop them in there so that we can get to them. We still have a few more questions before we pivot, but I want to make sure that if anybody has any specific questions that they want to ask our amazing panelists, now is your chance to plug them into that Q&A box. Marion, I want to ask you similarly about language access. Is it the same resource that Perry Jude mentioned? If somebody kind of comes in, maybe they're not able to have, a family member or a friend kind of come in with them to interpret on their behalf. What do they do if there's nobody actually available on site to support them in understanding and reading the ballot?
Well, I mean, that's a difficult question, but the election protection hotline does, I'm going to put the numbers in for the other languages, Spanish and English and Asian language and Arabic English hotlines. The formatting didn't come really well, but and Philadelphia used to have another line, but I don't know that it particularly worked very well. But um, I mean, it is that is the only resource that I'm aware of if voters do not have assistance from another person. So we'll keep trying to expand language accessibility across the Commonwealth.
It's so easy to get language access, right? I mean, all of us have access to contractors, right? I know we do. So when someone calls us in a language other than English, we can dial that number, get an interpreter on the line while that client stays on hold, and then we can go ahead and have that very important conversation about their legal rights. And there's no reason why counties can't deploy a number for poll workers to call so that you can have that very important conversation about voting or answering any questions people have about voting on election day. There's no reason that that shouldn't happen.
Totally agree. And I think the court system is trying to catch up with language access. So maybe the resources that the court system has put in, we could maybe deploy them, but that will be a battle for another day, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just something that I've done in the past when I've been at a polling place and somebody, only speaks Spanish, like I try to step up and support them. If they accept my help, that's obviously on them. But, if you speak a different language and you are able to help out, it's always great to be able to lend a helping hand in that instance if you are available and you want to support. But obviously it's up to the individual to kind of accept that help. But that's always something that I like to put out there to support everyone's right to vote if that's something that matters to you.
You raise a good point, and it just reminded me, some groups do have field programs. I think Latino Justice might have a field program, CASA might have a field program. So there might be people at the polling place. I think there is an Arabic language group in Philly that runs a program in West Philadelphia. And I think the Worry Center, which is Korean American group, also runs a field program. So there are and I think Viet Lead also in Philadelphia in Vietnamese language. So there are groups that are planning to send people to polling locations for that assistance.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. We'll make sure to link some of those groups and try to share them out in kind of like the follow-up from this event. Um, so I want to ask a question from somebody who submitted in advance of this discussion. Perry Jude, you actually kind of touched upon this a little bit, but this person is actually a poll worker. Her name is Marion in York County, and she wrote to us about what she saw as an issue around parking at her polling location and how kind of the only municipal parking available was a place where you would have to pay. And she kind of was like, that's like having to pay to vote. And, there wasn't like specifically a question there, but she brought that up. And that got me thinking about transportation as an accessibility issue. And that can range that really ranges in terms of like access for all different kinds of populations, depending on where you live and what access you have to transportation in general. So I'm just wondering if Perry Jude, if you could kind of speak to
Sure.
some options or resources that you are aware of, or maybe some suggestions in terms of like planning ahead on election day, if that's when you plan to vote, to kind of prevent any transportation issues that could be a barrier to you getting to your polling place.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, Marion from York, great question. I actually live in Northern York, and there have been times where I've dropped my ballot off at a drop box and I've had to pay to park to go exercise my right to vote. So I understand what you're talking about. I know exactly uh, uh, where you're at. And uh, yeah, so if you're a person who utilizes public transit and you're a person with a disability and you normally would call public transit to schedule your ride, I would say do it now. Like schedule your ride now to and from the polling place so that you're on that list to get picked up on election day. Don't wait until the day of to try to schedule your ride via public transportation, via your access provider, your ADA access provider to try to get to the polling place on election day because, people are doing other things besides voting, right? They're going to doctor's appointments, to grocery stores on that same transit. So please be sure to do that in advance and get that ride scheduled now. Um, People can utilize Uber and Lyft for rides, and they can call their local party. So if you are a member of a party, you can reach out to your county party, and they would be happy to get a ride for you on election day. There are also organizations within counties that will help people get access to rides on election day.
Amazing. I didn't realize that specific parties offer that, but
Oh,
I think
yeah.
sense because you want your people to turn
Want
out.
your people to turn out. So you can call the Republican Party or the Democratic Party in your counties, and I guarantee you they will work with you to get you a ride to the polling place.
Hmm. Fantastic. And I think the next one, I'll throw it over to you, Marion. Um, Hannah S. asked, what would you say is the impact of a lack of language access at the polls or even when registering to vote? I think that, the impact is kind of, clear, but if you could speak a little bit to that.
Well, I think it's much harder for voters who don't speak English as their first language to navigate the process. It's hard. It's hard enough as it is for most voters, right? So it's doubly hard for people who do not have the materials accessible. I think that the Department of State's recent translation of its website is super helpful. So I think that my advice would be start there. Because especially if one of the languages you speak is in the list, and when I look at the list, I'm sure it's based on population in Pennsylvania. So, but I think that if you did the analysis, you would see that those voters probably don't participate as much because the participation is blocked.
Yeah, thank you. I also agree. I think that um, the new kind of refreshed website, I think from like it happened before the primary, is definitely there's more languages and there's a lot more resources available on there. So that's a really great place to start. So we're almost at time, and I just want to ask one final question to you all. We're just a few weeks away from November 5th. And I know that, Marion, like you mentioned, there's a few cases that we're waiting to hear decisions on. And so, TBD on that. Who knows like when that will drop, but looking forward to maybe next year and the next few years. Marion, like what are some changes that you would like to see when it comes to expanding access in Pennsylvania or like that you anticipate or expect to see because of some things that are kind of like some lawsuits perhaps that are percolating right now?
Well, I mean, if the changes that we already talked about that are subject of the lawsuits we hope will come about. But um, we need the legislature to really step up and clarify the law. The changes that I would like to see are things that the Pennsylvania Voice and the Civic Engagement Table are working on. So the Voting Rights Act is, of course, federal legislation, but they would like to replicate those protections in state law. I mean, I call it a baby voting rights act, but I don't mean that pejoratively. It just means that it would be subordinate to the federal right, but it would codify in state law language access, assistance at the polls. It could even make the thresholds for providing language access lower than the federal requirements. So that's something that I think would go a long way. Also, obviously, we have a long way to go on the disability access as well, but we'll let Perry Jude speak to that.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Marion.
Perry,
I tell you.
go ahead.
Yeah, I tell you what I'd like to see in the very near future is that we figure out how to make provisional ballots accessible because I think Marion just talked about the importance of a provisional ballot to make sure people have that right to vote if something else goes wrong. And right now, if a person with a disability needs a provisional ballot and they're blind or low vision, they will not be able to vote that provisional ballot privately and independently, and that's a real problem.
Okay, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, as a journalist, I would not deign to tell the legislature, what legislation to pass, but I know that amongst election directors, one of some of the accessibility and just clarity surrounding ballot curing and drop boxes, um, the mail voting law as a whole is highly sought after and something that's bipartisan amongst election directors. It's not particularly like controversial legislation. Um, that's something that there have been bills that have passed like one chamber or the other, or parts of it have passed through the state legislature. So I think that's the thing that, at least as a government reporter, we're always kind of keeping an eye on because those are the things that seem like closest to crossing over the finish line. And oh, and just as a side note, because I thought I sent this in the wider chat, but I sent it just to the panelists and hosts. Asian Americans United in Philadelphia also provides language services for Asian languages if you're in Philadelphia.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all so much. That's all the time that we have for tonight. Thanks to our audience for hanging out with us on a Thursday evening, and to our amazing panelists for sharing all of their knowledge and expertise. We are so grateful for all of your work, and we'll make sure to share out all of the resources that we discussed. In terms of election coverage, you can continue to follow that at spotlightpa.org/elections. And you can also find some really great informative guides and interactive tools on there as well. And just for the sake of it, because I'm deep in deadline mode, October 21st is the last day to register to vote or to change your party affiliation. October 29th is the last day to request a mail ballot. And then, of course, Election Day is November 5th. So put those on your calendar, get those things done if that's something that you're interested in. That's all from me. Thank you all so much. I hope you have a great night, and we will follow up with you all with a recording of tonight's conversation and with the resources mentioned throughout the conversation. So thank you all so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you all.